What if the woman Prince Harry loved the longest didn't leave because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to say no? Let that sit for a second. Because for years, the story was simple. Too simple. Almost insultingly simple. Chelsy Davy couldn't handle royal life. Chelsy Davy didn't want the pressure. Chelsy Davy wasn't cut out for it. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That narrative stuck. It was repeated in tabloids, whispered in documentaries, and quietly accepted by the public like an unchallenged fact. But what if that story was never true? What if the real reason she walked away wasn't fear, but refusal? And what if, at 40, with distance, clarity, and nothing left to lose, Chelsy Davy finally allowed the truth to surface? Because this isn't just a breakup story. It's a story about comparison, about expectation, about what happens when a woman is subtly asked to compete in a game she never agreed to play. And at the center of it all is a quiet, uncomfortable claim that reframes everything we thought we knew. He wanted me to compete with Kate, and I refused. Not shouted, not weaponized, not dramatized, just stated. And that single sentence changes the entire story. For years, Chelsy Davy existed in the public imagination as a footnote. The girlfriend before the wife. The almost royal who slipped away. The one who couldn't go the distance. But here's the first uncomfortable question you need to ask yourself. Why would someone disappear that completely if they were simply heartbroken? Why no tell-all interviews? Why no book deals? Why no leaks? No whispers? No royal revenge tour? Why did Chelsy Davy cut off Prince Harry entirely? Not just romantically, but socially, emotionally, historically? People don't vanish like that unless they are protecting something. Or themselves. And that's where this story begins to matter now. Because Chelsy is no longer the 20-something girlfriend navigating flashbulbs and palace dinners. She's 40. She's lived a full life outside the royal orbit. She's built something real, something stable, something chosen. And distance does something powerful. It strips away fear. It dissolves obligation. It gives truth room to breathe. So when Chelsy Davy allows this reframing to exist, even indirectly, it forces us to revisit everything we thought we understood about that relationship, especially the moment it ended. Let's go back. Before the titles, before the hierarchy, before the comparisons that would quietly poison everything. When Prince Harry was still just Harry, impulsive, funny, restless, and deeply allergic to expectation. When Chelsy Davy wasn't trying to fit into anything at all. Their relationship didn't begin as strategy. It didn't begin as ambition. It began like most real connections do, unpolished, spontaneous, and emotionally uncomplicated. And that's important, because Chelsy never pursued the palace. She never angled for it, never reshaped herself for it, never studied it like a career path. She was independent in a way that didn't translate well to royal systems. Comfortable with herself, comfortable outside approval, comfortable saying no. Ask yourself this. How does an institution built on tradition respond to a woman who doesn't need it? At first, the difference is charming, refreshing, even. She's normal. She's grounded. She's a break from the rules. But that charm has an expiration date. Because eventually, normal becomes inconvenient. And that's when expectations quietly enter the room. Not through commands, not through ultimatums, but through comparison. And this is where Kate enters the story. Not as a villain, not as an antagonist, but as an unspoken benchmark. Kate Middleton didn't choose to be the standard any more than Chelsy chose to be measured against her. But once Kate's path was set, once her role crystallized, a template emerged. And templates are dangerous, because they turn people into checklists. Suddenly, the question isn't, who are you? It becomes, why aren't you more like her? Now imagine being in a relationship where love is real, but the future feels conditional. Where you're not explicitly told to change, but everything around you suggests you should. Your clothes, your behavior, your reactions, your comfort level with silence, scrutiny, sacrifice. And imagine being asked, directly or indirectly, to participate in a comparison you never asked for. To perform, to adapt, to compete. Here's the contradiction that rarely gets discussed. Chelsy Davy didn't struggle with attention. She struggled with expectation. She didn't fear the cameras. She feared the erosion of self. And that distinction matters. Because there's a massive difference between not being able to handle pressure and refusing to surrender autonomy. One is weakness, the other is strength. So why did the world accept the former so easily? Because it was convenient. It preserved the institution's image. It simplified the narrative. It allowed everyone to move on without asking uncomfortable questions, including Prince Harry. Prince Harry has spoken often about regret, about lost love, about timing. He's framed Chelsy as the one that got away, the woman he loved before everything became complicated. But here's the part that rarely gets examined. What if Chelsy didn't get away? What if she walked away, eyes open? What if she saw the trajectory early and decided she wouldn't contort herself to fit it? That changes the power dynamic completely. Because now the breakup isn't about inability. It's about refusal. And refusal is threatening, especially to systems that depend on compliance. Think about it. If Chelsy had stayed and suffered quietly, she would have been praised for endurance. If she had stayed and transformed herself, she would have been celebrated for adaptation. If she had stayed and broken, she would have been pitied. But she didn't do any of that. She left, and she left cleanly. No lingering appearances, no public nostalgia, no half-in, half-out emotional orbit. That kind of exit isn't impulsive. It's deliberate. And that brings us to the line that reframes everything. He wanted me to compete with Kate. I refused. Even if those words were never spoken out loud in that exact form, the meaning is unmistakable. Competition implies comparison. Comparison implies hierarchy. Hierarchy implies loss of self. And Chelsy Davy was never interested in winning a role she didn't audition for. Ask yourself something. If you were in love, deeply in love, but the price was becoming someone else, what would you do? Would you stay and hope it gets easier? Would you convince yourself love is enough? Or would you walk away before resentment hardens into something uglier? Chelsy chose the last option, and that choice echoes louder with time. Because years later, the world would watch another woman enter the same system and struggle with the same unspoken expectations. Only this time, the resistance would be public, explosive, and impossible to ignore. But Chelsy's story happened quietly, which is why it was misunderstood. Silence is often mistaken for weakness. In reality, it's sometimes the strongest boundary a person can draw. And now, at 40, with the benefit of distance, Chelsy Davy's story doesn't read like a failure to adapt. It reads like an early warning. She didn't lose Prince Harry. She preserved herself. And that raises the question that changes everything. What exactly did Chelsy see, years before anyone else did? Because once you understand what she refused to compete for, you begin to understand why she didn't just leave a man. She left an entire future behind. What if the most defining moments of someone's life happened before anyone even notices them? That's exactly how Chelsy Davy's story begins. Not in the flashbulbs of paparazzi cameras. Not in the echoing halls of royal protocol. Not in headlines declaring Prince Harry's girlfriend. No, it begins in a life entirely her own. A life filled with independence, adventure, and the kind of confidence that doesn't need validation. Chelsy wasn't born to royalty. She wasn't schooled in the subtle art of courtly diplomacy. She was a young woman navigating the world on her own terms. Zimbabwe-born, raised in a mix of cultures and values, she learned early that the world would offer judgments freely, and approval would have to be earned or ignored. She wasn't naive. She was observant. Not every glance or comment needed a reaction. Not every expectation needed fulfillment. Ask yourself this. How does a woman grow in a world that constantly measures her, even before she encounters a man like Prince Harry? She does so by cultivating autonomy. By learning how to enjoy her own company, how to make decisions for herself, and how to define her own happiness. Chelsy's early years, spent outside of royal attention, gave her a foundation most young women her age never experience. Before the palace, before the scrutiny, Chelsy was already a complete person. She didn't need anyone to rescue her or validate her. She had her ambitions, her friends, her passions, and the kind of self-assuredness that makes some people uncomfortable. Because let's face it, someone who doesn't bend is often mistaken for someone who can't bend. And yet, that's exactly the kind of person Prince Harry would eventually fall for. There was an energy about her that was unapologetically real. She laughed loudly. She challenged ideas. She could argue a point and walk away without resentment. That spontaneity, that grounded nature, was magnetic. It was refreshing to Harry, a reprieve from the curated, polished lives surrounding him. But it was also dangerous in ways neither of them realized at the time. Because institutions like the monarchy thrive on conformity, and people like Chelsy, who don't conform easily, disrupt that rhythm. Her independence was intoxicating, yes, but it also carried a warning. She wasn't malleable. She couldn't be molded to fit expectations, and that would matter more than anyone knew. The early years with Harry were marked by freedom and exploration. They could be reckless, playful, and genuine. A stark contrast to the pressures both would eventually face. Trips abroad, secret getaways, late-night conversations, all underscored by a shared understanding that they were, in many ways, just two ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances. But even in those moments, subtle signs were emerging, small cues that hinted at the world they were stepping into. A glance that lingered too long on public perception, a comment about how their relationship looked to others. Innocuous to the untrained ear, but audible to someone like Chelsy, whose instincts for self-preservation were finely tuned. And here's the tension. Chelsy had the ability to absorb pressure, to adapt when necessary, but she also had limits. Limits that were personal, moral, and psychological. She wasn't opposed to compromise entirely. She was opposed to losing herself in the process. That distinction is critical, because it wasn't that she couldn't handle the royal orbit. It was that she couldn't handle being asked to disappear within it. You might ask yourself, could anyone? Could anyone step into a world so meticulously controlled and maintain the essence of who they are? Chelsy could, for a time. But eventually, the subtle machinery of expectation, comparison, and hierarchy began to hum, quietly but relentlessly. Even in those early days, Harry noticed it. He saw the spark that made Chelsy different. He admired it. And yet, he didn't fully grasp what that difference would mean when juxtaposed with the pressures he would inherit. Love in its rawest form doesn't always foresee consequence. It doesn't always anticipate how external forces, whispers, comparisons, expectations, can erode even the most solid bonds. The couple's dynamic at this stage was not unusual. Playful teasing, heated debates, impulsive decisions. But underlying all of it was a quiet tension that neither could articulate fully. Chelsy's independence, which had always been her strength, was now subtly at odds with the trajectory Harry's life was taking. And while it wasn't apparent in the moment, the first seeds of divergence were planted here, long before the palace, long before public scrutiny, long before anyone else cared. It's easy to look back now and say, this was inevitable. But in truth, no one saw it coming. To the outside world, Chelsy Davy was simply Harry's girlfriend. Charming, beautiful, intelligent, and carefree. But inside, a more complicated truth was unfolding. A truth about agency, choice, and what it means to retain one's identity in a world that expects assimilation. And that truth would become the foundation for everything that came next. Because the qualities that made Chelsy magnetic in her 20s, her self-possession, her refusal to compromise who she was, were the very qualities that would eventually make her leave entirely. Not because of failure, not because of fear, but because she recognized an unspoken demand that she could never accept. Ask yourself, what would you do if someone you loved, someone you trusted, started hinting that your authenticity wasn't enough? What if the unspoken rule was to compete, not just for affection, but for a version of yourself you didn't want to become? Chelsy faced exactly that question. And she answered it long before the cameras, before the gossip, before anyone thought to notice. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most pivotal moments happen before the public is watching. That autonomy, foresight, and moral clarity are invisible until they're tested. Chelsy's early life, full of freedom and independence, wasn't just a backstory. It was a rehearsal for the moment she would ultimately choose herself over everything else. What if falling in love wasn't just about two people, but about timing, context, and the invisible walls around them? That was exactly the delicate balance in Harry and Chelsy's early relationship. He was the second son, the spare, living in the shadow of expectation. She was independent, self-assured, and unaccustomed to being measured against anyone, let alone royalty. And yet, the chemistry between them was immediate, electrifying, and disarming. From the start, Chelsy wasn't starstruck. She didn't gush at titles or lineage. She laughed at the trappings and found humor in the absurdities of the royal orbit. It was refreshing for Harry, whose life was saturated with ritual, protocol, and relentless public scrutiny. With Chelsy, he could be reckless, unpolished, even foolish, and be loved for it. That combination of authenticity and fearlessness was rare. But authenticity has a price in spaces built on appearances. The palace, the media, the expectations of family. All of it creates invisible boundaries, walls you don't always see until you bump against them. Chelsy bumped, lightly at first. A sarcastic comment here, a refusal to attend a formal event there. Nothing overt, nothing shocking, just a subtle insistence on autonomy that clashed with the subtle rhythms Harry was learning to navigate. Here's what makes this stage so pivotal. Harry, still young, was learning to reconcile his personal desires with institutional obligations. Chelsy, meanwhile, had already mastered that reconciliation in her own life. She knew when to bend and when to hold firm. But the problem was that bending in a royal relationship isn't just about compromise. It's about erasure, a quiet subtraction of self that often feels invisible until it's too late. Chelsy saw the warning signs early. Casual comments about appearance, offhand observations about behavior, the way whispers and glances were never neutral. She wasn't naive. She understood. In a way Harry didn't at the time. That love wasn't the only force shaping their future. There were expectations, metrics, and benchmarks he had yet to fully internalize. At first, it didn't matter. Their romance was genuine. Laughter, adventure, impulsive travel. Moments that seemed ordinary but were extraordinary for people under the constant gaze of the press. The excitement of stolen evenings, unscripted experiences, and raw connection cemented their bond. Chelsy could have stayed, believed in love alone, and ignored the subtle pressures creeping in around them. But that wasn't her nature. She was observant, thoughtful, and self-protective.